Hi, how are y'all doing?
I'm doing great, Luke. Thanks for asking.
Looks like everyone's here, so we can go ahead and get started with introductions.
All right. My name is Evan Lopez, and I'll be the affirmative speaker today. Thank you all so much for judging.
And my name is Luke Castle. I'll be honored of negating the resolution today. Thanks so much for taking your time. I really appreciate it.
And before we get this round started, I'm sure it'd be very helpful for both debaters if we just heard a little bit more about yourselves, as well as any past judging or debating experience that you might have, and anything we can do to make the round easier for you to judge. I guess we could start with the person on the very top left of my screen is Cole Manus. Do you have anything that you would like to share with us in terms of experience or anything that you'd like us to do?
I do not.
Okay. Mr. Jackson.
So I've got several years of debate experience, both high school and college. So I'm able to pretty much follow anything you say. My preference as far as judging philosophy goes is clear, concise arguments. If you make your conclusion apparent, then it'll be on my flow.
I also have some high school debate experience. I would second everything that Jackson said.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thank you all very much for taking the time to judge. All right, well, unless anyone has any objection, I guess we can go ahead and start the proceedings. This will be a 6-minute speech. If we're all ready, then we can go ahead and get started. As I've been working in childcare for the past couple of weeks, I've noticed something about the children there. Whenever they're playing with a toy, they know no one else can come and take that toy away from them without permission. Why? Because deep down, we all hate sense of personal private property. And because of that, I affirm the resolution that the protection of intellectual property should be valued above open source innovation. Let's understand what those words mean with some definitions. My first definition is intellectual property. According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, quote, intellectual property refers to creations of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs, and symbols, end quote. And protection of intellectual property would mean something along the lines of protecting those things, like, for example, patents, trademarks, copyrights, etc. My second definition is open source innovation, which is essentially a system that facilitates a free flow of information. There aren't those barriers to extending control from one person to another, like there is with protection of intellectual property. My resolutional analysis point, or an additional reason or a way for us to help interpret this resolution, is government policy. Again, government policy. And what I mean by this is that we should be looking at this resolution through the realm of whether or not there should be more government policy or legal protections protecting intellectual property, or we should be rolling this back and having less. Why? Well, my reason to prefer is a legal foundation. Again, a legal foundation. Everything in this resolution about intellectual property at its very root level comes down to the law. No one has the ability to value intellectual property without there being a legal protection for it existing in the first place. Thus, government policy is the clearest and most it makes the most sense for us to value it or understand how we look at this resolution. Let's get into understanding how we can wade between these two terms. My value is that of a functional economy. Again, a functional economy, and that consists of two things. Number one, it creates a solid platform for businesses to thrive and survive. Essentially, it creates a place where businesses can meet demand. The second part of a functional economy is the creation of a system of justice, where people's rights are protected, and ultimately, there isn't some basic violation of basic moral or ethical laws. Let's get into some contentions, understanding why a functional economy is upheld by intellectual property protections. My first contention is that protections are necessary for function. Again, they are necessary for function. A long time ago, our economy used to be based on things like physical assets, like cars or machines or land, etc., etc. But now all that has changed. Our economy and our market is based on innovation, things like intellectual property. According to the Global Innovation Policy Center, quote, America's IP is worth $6.6 trillion. IP-intensive industries account for over 1/3, or 38%, of total U.S. GDP. IP accounts for 52% of all U.S. merchandise exports, which amounts to nearly $842 billion, end quote. Now, what do all those big numbers mean? It means that America's intellectual property and intellectual property around the world is very, very valuable. And along with that value comes a protection for our economy and protection for American people. As it went on to say, quote, IP-intensive industries employ over 45 million Americans and hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Jobs in IP-intensive industries are expected to grow faster over the next decade than the national average, end quote. And there's a lot in that part too. For one, it means that a lot of Americans depend on the protection of intellectual property for them to have a job, for them to be able to feed their families. Without protections of intellectual property in place, businesses have nothing to gain value from. They collapse, they fold. Only the big businesses with lots of money in their reserves would be able to really survive in this whole overturning of the American economy's paradigm. And in fact, that leads to the vanishing of millions of jobs, and for Americans and for people in general, causing a world of hurt and pain. That's why protections of intellectual property are necessary to create a functioning economy. My second contention is that devaluation makes the economy unfunctional. Again, devaluation is unfunctional. Society has no right to take what one person has built up with their work, their genius, and their labor, and just take it away from them and distribute it for other people's benefit. Why? Well, imagine if society were structured in a way such that your physical property was fair game for everyone else. So your house, your car, is no longer your house or your car. Even though you worked and you paid for those things with your hard-earned money, suddenly other people can use it to their benefit because of what the government wants for them instead of what it wants for you. In fact, as Adam Mossoff, who's a professor of law at George Mason University School of Law, writing for the New York University Journal of Law and Liberty, quote, Lockean theory provides a conceptual explanation and justification for all property rights that arise from labor. The labor that produces a farm is morally equivalent to the labor that produces the technical inventions used in farming, end quote. In other words, your intellectual property is still your property, and your property rights protect it. No one, not the government, not other people, can take that away from you without your permission. Because government policy must favor intellectual property to sustain a functioning economy, I affirm the resolution. Thank you.
Alrighty. 3 minutes on the clock for cross-sex if you're ready.
Yes.
First up, congrats on semifinals. Can we agree that life is really important?
Sure.
Would you consider it to be a foundational right?
Yes.
Can we agree that we should protect foundational rights over monetary concerns?
Yes.
So anytime we have to decide between making money and upholding a foundational right, we always pick the foundational right, correct?
In most circumstances, sure.
Do most companies give away their stuff for free if they can make money from it?
If they can make money from it?
Uh-huh.
Most businesses wouldn't.
Okay, let me put in a hypothetical scenario. If someone created a COVID treatment, but made it so expensive only 3% of the world could afford it, would you support me committing corporate espionage to go and get that recipe and stop the current pandemic?
I'm sorry, Luke, you cut out for the first part of that question. Can you please repeat it?
Sure. If someone made a COVID treatment, but they made it so expensive only 3% of the population could afford it, so it wasn't really helping people, would you support me going and committing, say, corporate espionage to get that secret and stop the current pandemic?
It's a bit of a difficult question because it depends on the means being used.
Well, let's say that I just go and steal the idea because legally they refuse to give it to us.
Well, in that case, it depends on how you're trying to help other people.
Just answer the question. If I was going to take that idea and give it to everyone so the current pandemic could be stopped, would you support that?
Well, if that person who tried to create a COVID treatment will put a lot of time and effort into it, and you're violating their basic property rights, then at that point, I wouldn't support you saying go and just stealing it from them to give to everyone else.
Okay, so just to confirm, you would rather one person make some money than the entire world have the pandemic be stopped?
I would say if you're trying to violate their property rights, and not just in this instance, but if we were to adopt that as a general rule, that's not something that's okay.
Just answer the question. The one guy's property rights or stopping the pandemic? Which one should I value?
Well, if you're talking about just this one instance, with just one person who's trying to hoist the prices extremely high and ignore most of the market, then in that instance, it's okay if you want to try and save more lives.
Okay, so then at some point, intellectual property can be violated for the greater good.
At some point, but it shouldn't be violated as a general rule.
Can you define open source or open source innovation?
Can you please clarify?
Did you define the term open source or the term open source innovation?
Open source innovation.
All right, great. And you brought up the whole idea about intellectual property having jobs. Does open source innovation ever create jobs for people?
I don't know. It'd be your job to try and prove that to be the case.
Just do you think it's possible?
It might be possible for a business to try and employ people. That doesn't mean it's economically feasible or should be encouraged.
And with Lockean's, when was Lockean's theory created?
I believe John Locke was back in the 1700s or 1800s.
All right, great. No further questions. I've got 3 minutes of prep time. I'll take a bit of that now. No further prep time necessary. 2 minutes and 23 seconds remaining. Seven minutes on the clock, the length of the first negative constructive, if y'all are ready. Right? Let's go ahead and jump in. When I was 13, I witnessed the death of a close friend's mom. Her disease was so rare that there was no cure, but they kept her alive on life support for 6 weeks. During the course of that time, I watched them struggle with the fact that there was their mother, but she was never going to recover. This situation is awful for any 6-year-old to go through. But when you think about the fact that intellectual property is forcing this upon millions of families, you'll see why I negate our resolution. Resolved. Intellectual property should not be valued above open source innovation. I accept the definitions my opponent presented. I think we have a good understanding of what they are. He next presented a resolution analysis of government policy. Go ahead and write down my response as multiple actors. Now, I'm not excluding the government from this, but I do think we need to look at the private and nonprofit section as well. There's a lot of governments in the world, so we need to make these as a concept that can take place from multiple actors. There's no reason to limit this resolution to just governments, so let's have a discussion that looks at the entire field. Now, I'm also rejecting his value of functional economy. Go ahead and write down the reason for rejection as secondary concern. Functioning economy is great. When you have a country that's protecting rights, a functioning economy can be a wonderful thing. But if there's a more important concern that's a foundational right, we use that instead. So I present the counter value of life. Now, there's one reason to prefer this over anything that he might bring up, and it's that of foundation of morality. You can't be moral unless you have life. Protecting life is what drives society, and it's what keeps society in check. My second reason to prefer is conceded. In cross-examination, my opponent conceded we look at moral issues and issues of fundamental human rights before economic concerns. He conceded the value, therefore we're using it. The only question left on your flow is, does intellectual property protect life, or does open source innovation protect life? Let's look at that in 2 main contentions. Write down my first contention as protecting intellectual property harms life. Now, Evan did a really great job of presenting intellectual property as the bundle of roses that it's not. But the truth is that the intellectual property has a bunch of downsides which have been ignored by the affirmative team that far outweigh any benefits that might have. Let me bring you 2 applications. First, Pfister's Alzheimer's. I don't know if you know anyone with Alzheimer's, but I can tell you from personal experience, watching someone lose their mind is one of the hardest things you'll ever go to. Rebecca Clark, writing for the Hill on June 5th of 2019, writes, quote, a U.S. drug company did not openly share or perform studies on a successful rheumatoid arthritis medicine that internal research has found was reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. by 64%. Now, she's talking about a company called Pfizer. They're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States. And they basically found out that their drug could do this other great thing. However, doctors can't prescribe it. So he went and said, hey, would you mind testing this? And their answer was simple. No, that'll cost us $80 million. We're like, okay, well, can you give us the recipe so we can test it? And if it's a good thing, we can move on to have further curing of Alzheimer's. And they said, no, we want to protect our intellectual property. We'd rather have our money than have people be saved. Now, according to Alzheimer's News Today, in 2019, there is 44 million people suffering from Alzheimer's. 26 million of those could be cured if we'd stop valuing intellectual property. And that's not even the only instance that we see here. Application number 2, EpiPens. If you have a severe allergy, carrying an EpiPen is the difference between life and death. They're these little auto injectors which have a needle and a dose of epinephrine in them. So when you have an allergic reaction, you stick it in and it doses your body with an antihistamine to keep you from dying. Great invention. Now, it was created in 2001 and they charged a pretty reasonable cost. But not anymore, because according to Ryan Rittman, writing for Extreme Tech in October of 2016, Mylan has taken full advantage of their patent and in 2008 raised the price from $100 to $600. According to Charlie McRae for the Washington Post in 2016, an American is sent to the hospital every 3 minutes due to an allergic reaction. Before EpiPens increased in cost, that number was 6 minutes. Poor families can't afford an additional $500 every 2 months times the number of children that they have with allergies. The truth of it is, EpiPens raising their prices is forcing children to die because they can't afford the new price tag. And for what? A few dollars in the hands of a major pharmaceutical company. Here's what I want you to remember. The affirmative speaker will come up and talk about his favorite economicists and applications, pointing to the benefit of a functioning economy and innovation. And it's not going to matter because the cost of having those things is 26 million people with Alzheimer's, thousands of people with severe allergies, dead. Here's a better option. Contention number 2, upholding open source innovation protects life. We've seen there in the affirmative ways. Let's look at a little bit happier of an application. Application 3, polio treatment. Now, in 1955, a man named Dr. Salk created an antibody that would basically sweep the country. See, according to NPR, in 1952, 58,000 children were diagnosed with polio. 3,000 of them died. The rest never walked again. But Dr. Salk created an antibody, and trust me, he could have made some money from it. But in a live interview on April 12th of 1955, once again with NPR, he officially passed over his ability to patent the product, saying he would rather watch children walk and live than have a few dollars in his pocket. So he said he knew that if he patented it, a company would sweep it up, and they would pay him, but they wouldn't lower the cost. So the only way to keep the world from manipulating it and get it to the children was to turn over his ability to the patent. Because he did that, polio has been eradicated in the United States. Open source innovation takes the ideas people need and says, let's take them out of the closet and get them to the people who need them. Open source innovation saves lives by making things accessible. Let's just find a couple of my opponent's points. For starters, he talked about how it's necessary for protection. My response is that of results. Look, he's talking about all these companies and all these money. That's great, but we also need to look at the results of open source innovation. See, sure, Pfizer's making a lot of money from having their Alzheimer's medicine or from having their arthritis rheumatoid medicine, but they're not really helping many people. Open source innovation might not make as many dollars right now, but it protects millions of people, and that is a clear justification. And next, he talked about 45 million Americans have jobs because of IP. My response is incorrect. Open source innovation creates jobs as well. For instance, there's a company called Acquia who runs on a software called Drupal. They employ 1,000 people just by having those people go and install open source code for other people. Open source innovation makes plenty of jobs, and we don't need IP. Next, he talked about how devaluation is unfunctional. My response is that of leave the cops. Now, basically, this idea was that we're going to lose all property rights. That's silly. I'm not talking about all property rights. You can still own your house. We're just talking about intellectual property rights, like medicine recipes and important things like that. Finally, he talked about the Lockean theory. My response is modern concerns. I love Locke. He's a great philosopher. He also lived in the 1700s. We have a lot of concerns now that he couldn't have had an opinion on simply because by the time they surfaced, he was dead. Here's what it boils down to. He's going to come up and talk about money, dollars, and jobs. And it's not going to matter because intellectual property is killing millions of people across the globe. And if we want to do what's right, we have to negate the resolution.
All right. If you're ready, Luke.
I am.
All right, and I'll assume that our judges are ready as well. And with that, we can start the cross-examination. Okay. So would you say, on average, you're in favor of violating property rights if it upheld life?
I'm in favor of violating intellectual property rights. We're not talking about taking away trains. We're talking about important medical records.
But would you say that intellectual property rights are still a property right?
I believe that there is a difference.
So intellectual property rights are not property rights.
I believe there's a substantial difference. I can go into it now or I can go into it later.
Okay, but just to be clear, you do not believe that intellectual property rights are property rights.
I did not say that they are not inherently property rights. I said they are very different, have different classifications and different handlings.
Mm-hmm. So let's say Amazon, as a very successful and rich company, has a lot of money. And that money could go to buy a lot of EpiPens for a lot of people with allergies. Do you support the government stepping in and taking that money to buy EpiPens for people who are at risk of having an allergy?
That is a very different situation. Well, it'd be a really cool thing for Amazon to do. You're talking about violating their inherent property rights that come with foundational property, not intellectual property.
Okay, but you would not support that.
Well, that is a physical property right. It's very different from an intellectual property.
But as a physical property right, you would not support that.
Of course not, because it's physical, not intellectual.
Okay, so but their physical property rights would keep them, or would not be something that would outweigh those other people's rights to life.
Right. The difference is physical property rights involve labor. So they've done that by having actual working. Intellectual property is different because it's a concept. It doesn't inherently require labor and can have a lot of different roles.
Okay, so it's your position that because intellectual property does not require labor, it inherently is not something that would override other people's lives.
It does not require, it does not inherently require labor.
Mm-hmm. You talked then about the idea of protection harms life, and you talked about the medical industry. Would you be in favor of the government getting rid of patents for those drugs, for those different issues?
I absolutely would. In fact, there's an article by the World Health Organization and in association with the U.S. Health Institute, which said that if we remove those patents, we would probably see about 30% of our current diseases cured within the next few years.
Okay, and that's contingent upon having new research being done, new development being done of new drugs, right?
I mean, that's pretty much a given.
Mm-hmm. Next, you talked about Pfizer's, and on that same issue, who exactly is violating those people's rights to life? Who is violating the people's rights to life if they have an allergic reaction?
Pfizer, or
okay.
in the instance of EpiPens.
Okay, so it's because Pfizer has a product that could save someone's life from natural causes, they are violating those people's rights to life.
Right, they are absolutely refusing to perform the necessary testing so it can be cured.
Okay, so you would hold those people of Pfizer for murder, for example?
Not legally, because it is not a legal constraint, but I think it should be.
Okay, so you believe that Pfizer should be legally held responsible for murder?
May I finish answering even the timer went off? Okay, I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, I think that keeping a drug and refusing to test it or let anyone else test it and watching 26 million people die every single year is a pretty good reason that they would be considered an unethical corporation.
All right, no further questions. I'll be starting prep time. All right. I have stopped prep time with 1 minute and 57 seconds remaining. All right. I'm going to go ahead and assume that both my judges and my opponents are ready. Or my opponent, excuse me. All right. I'll get started with my 4-minute speech. Quote, it takes at least 10 years for a new medicine to complete the journey from initial discovery to the marketplace. The average cost to research and develop each successful drug is estimated to be $2.6 billion, end quote. This comes from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, talking about how hard it is to create a new drug, how expensive it is, and how much labor it requires. To my opponent, protecting that is just a legal construct. And if those people were to withhold other people from freely accessing that drug, they should be held for murder, which isn't exactly something that makes sense when we look at the logic and the philosophy behind it. Let's start off by understanding how we analyze this resolution. So he says that we need multiple actors under my resolutional analysis of government policy. My response is requires narrowing. Again, requires narrowing. Here's the problem. What a government is morally obligated to do and contractually obligated to do is very, very different for individuals. Normal people like you and me are obligated to do or ought to do. What a government legislates isn't necessarily what other people in their normal everyday lives ought to be choosing to do. So we need narrowing. We need some kind of way to decide between them. At least to my second response, reason to narrow. Again, a reason to narrow. I brought up a whole reason, the legal foundation of this resolution, talking about how inherently intellectual property comes from the law. And he didn't really disregard that. He just disregarded it. He didn't really respond to that. Because this resolution needs narrowing, and because government policy makes the most logical sense, this is how we ought to analyze the resolution. Next, let's move down to the value. Now, he said he presented a value of life. My response is by ethical means. Again, by ethical means. I asked in cross-examination if the government is contractually or morally obligated to take all of Amazon's excess money and pay to try and save the life, and take that to try and pay for the lives, to save the lives of others. And he said, well, no, because it's violating their property rights, their physical property rights, as he made very clear to be distinct. That means that even though those people have a right to life, Amazon also has a right to their property, which would override that. And that's very crucial into understanding why people's property rights are still something that must be valued. We can't just trample over them anytime life can be saved. That leads me to my second contention. I know I'm jumping around a bit, but there's a very logical order to this idea. He says that it's just intellectual property. It doesn't have the same worth. My response is inherently a property right. Again, inherently a property right. Here's the problem. As I talked about at the very beginning, intellectual property inherently requires labor and time and effort to make happen. You can't just come up with an idea without laboring on it. These pharmaceutical companies can't come up with the drug without spending years or decades and billions of dollars making them. This is a property right. They have put labor into it. It inherently is something that belongs to them and to no one else. Let's move on to his case. I have 3 overall responses. My first response is no conflict. Again, no conflict. Once again, we're talking about not necessarily just whether those people ought to decide to make their property open source. We're talking about the government stepping in and forcing it on them. And my opponent would say we should be holding things like Pfizer liable for murder. That leads me to my second response, the alternative. Again, the alternative. My opponent is literally arguing for the government to step in and say, okay, your property right could help, your property can help someone else and save their life. Therefore, we are morally obligated to take your property and apply it to them. Here's the problem with that line of thinking. Pfizer isn't inherently violating the life of another person. They are dying to natural causes. Pfizer has an ability to stop it or to prevent that natural cause from harming them, but Pfizer is not causing that natural cause to harm them. There's a very clear difference of who ought to be held liable. Let's move on finally to the idea of the money. My response is massively outweighed in my contention. He says that open source can provide jobs too. However, the American economy depends on intellectual property. We'll crush it without it. Thank you.
I have 2 minutes and 23 seconds of prep remaining. I'll take a bit. No further pressing necessary. Six minutes on the clock for the negative rebuttal if you're ready. All right, I'm going to assume the judges are ready and go ahead and jump in. I want you to imagine with me that right before you there's a child, and they're done. Now the cure exists, but you can't access it because a company has it locked off, and you're not, and they're refusing to let it go. Imagine with me that the cure exists, but you can't afford it. Now contrast it with the world open source wants to create, a place where someone's sick and we have the cures, and we use the cures we have to actually change people's lives. When you look at the issues my opponents presented, they are massively outweighed by the fact that intellectual property is killing millions of people. It's logically incoherent to value money over people, which is why I ask you to please negate the resolution with me. Before I jump into my main speech, I want to point out the three main voting issues I'll be pulling through. First, I'll be talking about there's no specific actor. Secondly, I'll be talking about why life is most important. And three, why open source innovation is the only way to protect life. We'll deal with those at the end of this speech, but I want you to keep those in mind. Now, for starters, he brought this idea about 10 years and $2.6 billion due to intellectual property. My first response is that of faults of IP. In fact, according to the National Institute of Health, in their January 5th of 2010 article, one of the reasons it's so expensive is because of intellectual property. It's about an eighth of the cost to make that same drug in a different country if open source innovation is valued. So sure, our number is high right now, but a large part of that is inflation due to IP. In open source communities, you can develop a drug for about $44,000 to $46,000, which you can easily collect by donations, and I'll bring up an application of this in just a second. Next, my second response is that open source historically worked. The other thing I want you to consider here is I'm not just saying it's possible, like some Chicken Little who's running around with a big brain. I'm saying that it's historically happened. We're contrasting what happened in history with intellectual property, and we're contrasting what happened through history with open source. This isn't my opinion. This is just the facts of what's happened in the past. Now, next, you brought this idea about how it requires narrowing and the reason to narrow. Two responses. One, no reason to limit. I don't see a specific reason to limit this to the government if businesses can also enact it. Secondly, government external. The government has laws on intellectual property right now, but we have both intellectual property and open source within the country. So they're obviously external and taking a back seat, and evaluating from the government's point of view is silly. Third response, even if you still think we should value this from the government point of view, I'm pretty sure protecting the lives of their citizens is the most important thing they can do. They talked about by ethical means. My response is standard of ethicality. I believe life is the standard of ethicality. So sure, let's use ethical means, as an ethical meaning protecting life. They talked about inherently a property right. My response is intangible. Intellectual property is separate. That's why we can have this debate round. If this debate round was about property rights versus no property rights, it would be a very boring debate. Whether or not intellectual property is considered a property right is one of the largest and most heated discussions in today's world. He doesn't get to, with no warrant, claim that it's true. He talked about no conflict in the alternative. My response is businesses acting. So talk about governments forcing them to lose their property rights, but I want to point out in the majority of instances, businesses take this action themselves. Second response, even if the government is the one taking the action, protecting life is still their foundational concern. As in the Declaration of Independence, our country was founded on protecting life, liberty, and property in that order for a specific reason. Life still trumps property rights, even from a governmental point of view. Finally, talked about massively outweighed. My response is, by what? He just comes up and says massively outweighed with no specific warrant, historical example, or study. I don't think it's outweighed by nothing. Now we've got those responses out of the way, let's move into three voting issues, or the three reasons I want your ballot. If any of these still hold true when Evan's done speaking, you're voting negative. Here's the first one, no specific actor. Now, if you agree with me on this one, his case pretty much falls apart. Because we don't have a specific actor. We don't have a government actor or a business actor within the resolution. And he can't provide us a reason why we need to limit it. He says he thinks it's necessary to limit it, but he doesn't provide a reason for that. We don't have a specified actor, so there's no reason to limit our discussion to some unspecified source when there's no warrant for that. My second voting issue you can write down as life. Now, he hasn't really agreed or disagreed with this value. So since it's my last speech, I'm assuming he agrees with it. But just to further affirm it, I want to bring up three subpoints. First, foundational. Life is foundational. It's foundational for everybody. It's our primary concern. I can't say this enough. No matter what instance we're in, killing me for no reason is always immoral. It doesn't matter if you're going to make money or if it's going to save someone else. If I'm innocent, it's still immoral for you to kill me. Secondly, conceded. Cross-ex, he basically gave me the value by admitting rights are more important and life is a fundamental right. That's enough of a reason for you to use this value. Thirdly, imperative. He's already, but it's a moral imperative. We don't get to just move around it and move around at will. Finally, even if government. If it's the government, this actually becomes even more important. Because see, a government has an obligation to protect life before liberty and property. That's why they're written in that order. Here's what it boils down to. You're using the value of life because it's the most important thing for businesses or governments to value. That leaves us one question. Does open source innovation or intellectual property do a better job at protecting life? My final voting issue you can write down as OSI. I'm going to have 4 subpoints. First, applications. I brought up 2 specific applications already, and I'd like to 3 specific applications, and I'll pull out a 4th one now. Application, OpenMRS. Ever wondered what happened to Ebola, that disease that was going to kill us all and then just stopped? Well, it's actually stopped not by Big Pharma, but by 111 volunteers working across the globe to create a system that got drugs to the people who need them and medical records to where they were needed the most. It was stopped by open source innovation and saved 16 million people. Secondly, analysis. I brought up analysis from the National Institute of Health, as well as applications and logical facts. It obviously makes sense why open source innovation is more beneficial than intellectual property. Third, you can write down as protects life. This is the crux of the case. If we want to take ideas, if we want to change our world, we get our ideas out of the closet and we give them to people. If it's a government point of view, they have to protect life first. If it's a business point of view, they have to protect life first. Historically, logically, and with every logical precedence, open source innovation is better at doing this than intellectual property. For that reason, you're voting negative. Thanks.
All right, I'll be continuing affirmative prep time. No more prep time is needed. This will be a 3-minute speech. I'm going to assume that both my judge and my opponent are ready, or my judges, excuse me. All right, let's get started. Here's the problem. In the negative world, not just one instance, not in 2 instances, not in 3 instances, not in 4 instances, but the majority of the time, my opponent is arguing for us to devalue the protection of intellectual property in favor of open source innovation. I want to help you understand what exactly that realistically would look like if we take all the emotions and just look at the facts. I'm going to be doing that by boiling the round down to 3 main voting issues, and all these will deal with some argument or another that was presented in the last speech. Okay, my first voting issue requires an actor. Again, requires an actor. Now, he brought up 3 responses. He says there's no reason to limit, and he says the government is external, and he also says even if. Now, here's the problem. The resolution requires an actor, as I've been saying the entire time, because what a government ought to do, the reasons behind a government action, is very different from what individuals and businesses ought to be choosing to do. Thus, we can't say, oh, both of them can just choose the same thing on average, because there are 2 completely different sets of issues here that we have to debate if we want that to be the case. Thus, we have to choose one. I presented a reason why the government is the clearest option, and Lucas simply said, well, there is no reason to limit it down, not really responding to the idea that I brought up in my past 2 speeches. Thus, an actor is very clearly, logically, the conclusion that we need, and therefore we are looking at this through the realm of government policy. And you talked about even if, and I'll be responding to that a little bit later. My second voting issue, property is property. Again, property is property. Now, this might be the most important issue in the round. Here's the problem. My opponent is essentially saying that intellectual property isn't really a property right. It's not the same as physical property. I brought up in my last speech about how intellectual property is property because it requires labor. The one thing that my opponent said, physical property makes a fundamental right. And he said later on, well, actually, it doesn't cost that much money when you value open source. Actually, this isn't really the case. Here's the problem, though. Intellectual property still, at its root, requires someone to put labor into something, thus construing it and making it into the realm of private property. Why is that important? Because property is a fundamental right, as we'll be getting to my third and final voting issue, the negative world. Again, the negative world. Now, my opponent would like to have you believe that, oh, it's okay if we just violate these property rights if we're saving lots of people's lives. In fact, he even said, life comes before liberty and property, therefore the government should value it. Here's the problem. Subpoint A, fundamental contradiction. Again, fundamental contradiction. I asked in cross-examination, should the government go and take Amazon's money, their physical property, and try to use it to save lives? And he said, obviously not. Why? Because subpoint B conceded. Because your property rights in a world where they would systematically be violated is not a world in which we can live. It's not one that is moral or ethical. Even if it sounds hard in the beginning, it is the proper choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for judging. I appreciate each and every one of your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also great job, Luke.
Thanks, you too. Have a great tournament, y'all.
Thank you.
Great job, guys.